Go ahead and turn your Bibles to Genesis 26. Genesis 26. As we continue our study in this second period of biblical history, I was thinking there during Ricky's lesson, something I heard this year at PTP, Polishing the Pulpit, and it was very interesting. They, I believe it was Glenn Colley and may have been someone else, I can't remember exactly, but they were discussing black and white congregations uniting. And I thought it was a really good discussion, some thoughts that maybe we haven't thought about before, but in the process of that, they were talking about, I believe it was Glenn who said that in years past he had really tried to get black and white congregations to unite. And he said over the years, he's kind of backed off of that. And he said some of the black brethren had basically made mention of, if black and white congregations unite, what oftentimes happens. Who adapts? Do the black brethren, do they adapt to the white culture, or do the white culture adapt to the black culture? Well, most of the time it's going to be the black adapting to the white. And so with that in mind, it might not always be. We certainly as Christians ought to be able to worship and work together in the kingdom of God, but I understand what's saying. It kind of goes back to what Ricky was talking about. Rather than Christianizing them, we're doing something else, and that kind of might fit into that just a little bit. Notice on our outline, I started out with something that we've talked about, imperfect men, but thankfully a perfect God. And God can do, and of course God can do great things, period, but He can do great things with faithful men. And when you think about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, as we've already talked about, they all had weaknesses, but faithful men. And it was a process for them, just as it is for us, that we seek to grow. Now, in Genesis 27 down to about chapter 35, we've talked about Abraham and somewhat about Isaac, but Isaac kind of begins to fade into the background, and Jacob now becomes the prominent one. In Genesis chapter 26 and verse 24, notice what we read. And the Lord appeared unto him, now this is Isaac, the same night, and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father, fear not, for I am with thee, and will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abraham's sake. Now, one of the things that I've mentioned several times, and I'll keep mentioning, is that as we move along and we look at these periods of biblical history, and especially as we look at the lives or contemplate some things related to the lives of these four men, every step of the way, whether you're talking about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph and the events of their lives, go backwards to Genesis 3:6 and Genesis 3:15 and forward to the cross. And so everything is tied into that, and it goes back to what I talked about at the very beginning of our study together. The Bible is one book with 66 different chapters, and each chapter is interrelated and tied together by that one common thread, which is redemption in and through Jesus Christ. So it doesn't matter what book you're in. It doesn't matter who the individual is that we may be looking at or talking about. It's all interrelated and interconnected then to the coming of Jesus Christ. And of course, after the coming of Christ, everything we have looks back then, of course, to the cross. Now, the promise then is renewed here in relationship to Isaac. And Abraham was called in Genesis 12. Isaac is born of Abraham, and there's Ishmael. And on our outline, I asked what's the difference between Ishmael and Isaac, Jacob and Esau. And really it comes down to this. There were a lot of differences, but the major difference was, when you think about especially, it's more personified with Jacob and Esau. What would you think? Let me ask you this. What would you think was the major difference between Jacob and Esau? Jacob now, we see early on in his life, I started a series Sunday here at 6th Avenue on lessons from the life of Jacob and Joseph. And the early part of Jacob's life, as we mentioned last time, was spent doing a lot of deceiving and trying to accomplish what God had promised his way. All right, but what set him apart from Esau? Well, I think it can really be highlighted when you look at the selling of the birthright. Who had, and whose birthright and blessing was it? All right, now, some said Esau, some said Jacob. Now, generally speaking, whose would it have been? Esau's, but whose was it? Jacob's. Because when you look in Genesis chapter 25, when Rebekah is pregnant with Esau and Jacob, and she's having issues and problems, and she goes to God in relationship to it, and God tells her there's two nations in your womb, and the older will serve the younger. All right, so when we sometimes talk about the stolen birthright, was it really a stolen birthright and a stolen blessing? No, not from the vantage point of God had promised it to Jacob. Now, what Rebekah did and what Jacob did in their scheming and conniving, they were morally culpable for that. And it was not right. What should they have done? What? Trusted God. God had promised it. If they'd have just waited on God, God would providentially provide it away in relationship to the birthright and the blessing. And the birthright and the blessing are, of course, distinguished one from another in that the birthright had to do more with the physical and the material, and the birthright, of course, would be given to the eldest son under most circumstances, and a double portion would be given to the eldest son. And it would also have to do with the elder son then taking over, so to speak, the leadership role once his father had passed. But when you think about the blessing had to do more with the spiritual and the promises that God had made, and God bringing those things about. And that's why what we see once Jacob had his 12 sons, who was the oldest? Reuben. But was Reuben the heir? No, because of his sin. And you had Simeon and Levi. Neither were they, and Judah became the bloodline, the birthright through whom Jesus came, and Joseph received the blessing. And so you had a difference there in that. Now, when you think about what took place, Isaac was wrong in that, and I think we might have mentioned this last time, but Isaac was wrong in that he knew what the promise was. Rebekah was wrong. She knew what the promise was. Jacob knew what the promise was. All right, that brings us then to that final thing. Why did Esau sell his birthright? The Hebrew writer said he was profane. What does that mean? He had no concern for spiritual things. Now, as imperfect as Jacob was the birthright and the blessing important to him? Yes. There was some spiritual or spirituality, if you will, in Jacob. There was not a morsel in Esau. And so that is, in my judgment, one of the major differences then between Esau and Jacob. Now, God renews that promise. Genesis 25 and 21, God made that promise, of course, to Rebekah. And we talked about the birthright and the blessing, and it belonged to to Jacob rather than Esau. Now, all of them, as I said, were wrong. Now, go to Genesis 27 and look at verse 36. Now, this is, of course, after Esau realizes and recognizes he's not going to receive the blessing. Now, Esau had no concern about the birthright, had a little bit concern in relationship to the blessing. And he wants to be blessed, and once the blessing was given, it could not be revoked. And you had a situation then where he was going to have to deal with the consequences of the decision that he made, even though God had already promised that to Jacob, but I suspect it's because God knew Esau. All right, now, as you look at Genesis 27:36, and he said, "Is not he rightly named Jacob? For he hath supplanted me these 2 times, took away my birthright, and behold, now he hath taken away my blessing. And he said, hast thou not reserved a blessing for me?" Now, here's something that jumps out to me here. Notice how Esau frames this. He took away my birthright. That's how Esau perceived it. Now, how many times in the church, from a distance, do we see something take place and something happen, and it just seems obvious to us what is wrong and who is in the wrong? But then when you begin to talk to people that may be involved in it, they see it in a totally different way. And it's kind of like, and let me ask you this, do we have to deal with it when it's like that? Yeah, we have to deal with it. I had, when I was still a principal, high school principal, superintendent, and this was right before I came on board as a principal, but the high school principal told me about it. The old superintendent was just, he didn't have any filter, tactfulness. He'd chew you out anytime, any place, anywhere for anything. Well, he is in the high school principal's office, and he's chewing him out and telling him, you need to be more concerned about what some of the parents are saying in relationship to this and how you went about doing this. And the principal said, I don't care what they think about it. And I understand what he was saying. I believe I did the right thing. But the superintendent said to him, that's the problem. Because perception oftentimes is what? Reality. Okay? I may perceive something to be a certain way in it, and I may not be right. But because I've perceived it that way, it becomes reality to me. And when someone is set in their reality, it's not always easy to convince them otherwise and to change their mind. Well, Esau saw it very differently from the way things played out. Now, did Jacob try to deceive? Obviously he did. Did he try to catch him at a weak point? Obviously he did. He was pretty sharp. He played on the weaknesses of Esau. But Esau would have never given away his birthright if it would have meant to him what it should have meant to him. But it didn't. And so you have then that situation. Look at Genesis 28 and verse 1. Now, even at this point, I want you to notice that Rebekah, now Esau wants to kill his brother because of what has taken place. And notice verse 46, and Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these, which are the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do me? And Isaac called Jacob and blessed him, and charged him, and said unto him, Thou shalt not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. Arise and go to Padanaram, to the house of Bethuel, thy mother's father. Take thee a wife from thence, the daughters of Laban, thy mother's brother. Now, notice here Rebekah plays still again Isaac. And she throws this out here to Isaac, and she convinces Isaac that Jacob needs to go away, but yet Jacob comes away thinking it's his idea. And so she's still making deals, and what you see is the same thing in Jacob. He continued all the way up to Genesis chapter 32, trying to make deals and trying to work and connive and do things his own way. And I'm not going to get too far into this because I probably will preach on this Sunday at 6th Avenue, but you get to the dream that Jacob had. God appears to him in a dream, and you see the ladder. Take a look at the prayer that Jacob offers to God there and see what you see. And then go over to Genesis 32 and look at the prayer Jacob offers there, and look at the difference in the prayers. And I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to stop right there so Vance will have his time.